In the spring of 2007, every cattle rancher in Calhoun County, Texas, did the same thing when the grass started thinning. They called the feed supplier. They ordered in hay by the truckload. They put their cows on supplement cubes and hoped the rain would come by May, and they didn't ask too many questions about whether it would, because that is what you did in Calhoun County when the pastures went short. You bought feed. You carried your herd through. You did not reduce your numbers until the bank made you, and sometimes not even then. Nobody questioned it the way nobody questions the direction of the wind. You did it because your father did it, and his father did it. And the county agent had a standing order with 3 different hay brokers in 3 different counties so that when the calls started coming in March, he could move fast, all of them managing the same way, none of them asking whether the management itself was part of the problem. Let me tell you about Calhoun County in 2007, because you need to understand the land before you can understand what one 54-year-old man did to it, and what it did back to him. The county runs along the Texas Gulf Coast in a long, flat sweep of coastal prairie that has been grazed since before anyone alive can remember. The soil is a dark clay that holds water when it rains, and cracks like old pottery when it doesn't. The grass is a mix of native blue stems and introduced Bahia and coastal Bermuda, and it grows fast in wet years and burns back hard in dry ones. The ranches are not as large as the ones in West Texas, 500 acres here, 800 there, a few running up past 1,000, and most of them run stocker cattle or cow-calf pairs on perennial pasture that gets divided into 2 or 3 paddocks and rotated loosely, which is to say, grazed down and then rested until it grows back enough to graze again. The sale barn in Port Lavaca was the center of commerce the way the high school football stadium was the center of community, and the feed store on Highway 35 was where you went to find out what everyone else was thinking, and what everyone else was thinking was almost always the same thing. The Alderdice Ranch sat 9 miles north of Seadrift on a county road that turned to shell gravel after the second cattle guard. Walter Alderdice had ranched it for 26 years, inheriting it from his wife's family in 1981 when her father passed and left 620 acres and a set of corrals that needed new planks and a note at the Victoria National Bank that took Walter 8 years to clear. He was not a man who had grown up ranching. He had grown up in Corpus Christi, studied range science at Texas A&M on a partial scholarship, and come to the land by marriage rather than by birth. That distinction had mattered in the early years when he was still learning the land by making mistakes in it, and it had stopped mattering sometime around 1995 when his neighbors had started asking him questions instead of the other way around. He had a reputation for being careful with his grass. He did not overstock. He gave his pastures full rest periods. He kept records, which most of his neighbors did not, and his records went back to 1983 in a set of green metal file boxes in the ranch office that occupied one corner of a room that also served as a laundry room and a place to store saddle pads. His daughter was Philippa Alderdice, and she had just come back from 3 years working as a grazing consultant in New Mexico with ideas that Calhoun County was not going to enjoy hearing. Let me tell you about Philippa Alderdice, because she is the reason this story exists. She was 28 years old when she came back to the ranch in the summer of 2007. She had graduated from Texas A&M with a degree in range science, the same department her father had studied in 26 years before, and then spent 3 years working under a man named Adrian Cortez, a grazing consultant in Eddy County, New Mexico, who had built a regional reputation for turning overgrazed, depleted ranches into productive ground using a system of planned grazing that most conventional ranchers in the area had initially dismissed as impractical. Philippa had managed 14 different client operations in those 3 years. She had walked more degraded pasture and read more soil health data and watched more grass respond to rest than most range scientists see in a decade of extension work. She had come home because her father had asked her to, not because he was sick or in trouble, but because he was 54 years old and the ranch was 620 acres, and he was, for the first time in 26 years, not sure what came next. She came home with a proposal. It was, by Calhoun County standards, somewhere between puzzling and dangerous. She did not want to manage the East Pasture the way it had always been managed. That was the beginning of it. The East Pasture was 180 acres of coastal Bermuda and native mixed grass that had been the backbone of the ranch's carrying capacity for as long as anyone had run cattle there. It was decent ground, flat and well watered by a seasonal creek that ran most of the year, and it had supported 60 to 70 cow-calf pairs through every rotation Walter had used. What Philippa wanted to do with it was different enough that when Walter heard it, he set down his coffee cup and looked at his daughter the way you look at a map when you suspect it might be printed upside down. She wanted to divide it, not into 2 paddocks or 3, the way every ranch in the county divided their pastures, but into 8. 8 paddocks on 180 acres, connected by a lane system, with a planned move schedule that would give each paddock between 90 and 120 days of rest between grazings. She also wanted to introduce a mix of warm-season native grasses into the paddocks that had lost the most density, including little bluestem and sidiawats, rama, and a small amount of buffalo grass along the drier ridge that ran through the northeast corner. She had fencing estimates, a water system layout, a grazing chart that extended 18 months into the future, and a cost-benefit analysis in a leather-bound notebook that her father looked at without speaking for a long time. Let me tell you about the science, because it is the reason she was right, and the reason the county took several years to believe her, and those 2 things are not unrelated. What Philippa had spent 3 years studying with Adrian Cortez was the relationship between grazing impact and soil biology. The argument was not complicated, but it was counterintuitive, which is the kind of argument that gets laughed at in a feed store before it gets adopted in an extension bulletin. When you graze a pasture continuously, or even on a loose 2 or 3 paddock rotation, you are allowing the cattle to select. They walk the same paths. They graze the palatable plants first and repeatedly. They avoid the less palatable ones. Over time, the desirable plants weaken from repeated defoliation before they can photosynthesize enough to rebuild their root systems. The undesirable ones, the stuff the cows won't eat, expands into the space the weakened plants leave behind. You end up with a pasture that looks grazed but is carrying less and less productive biomass every year, which means you need more acres to run the same number of cows, or you need to buy more feed, or both. And because the decline is slow, measured in years, most ranchers never connect the cause to the effect. They just know the grass doesn't seem to go as far as it used to. They buy more hay. They call it drought. Sometimes it is drought, but sometimes it is the management, and the drought is just what reveals it. Planned grazing with long rest periods did the opposite. It allowed each paddock to fully recover before it was grazed again. The desirable grasses rebuilt their root systems, the biological activity in the soil, the fungi and bacteria and earthworms that move water and nutrients through the soil profile, recovered between events. Over a period of 3 to 5 years on ranches Philippa had worked with in New Mexico, the carrying capacity of the land had increased by 20 to 40% without any additional inputs. The forage base deepened, the water infiltration improved. The ranches that had been buying hay every dry year had reduced or eliminated their supplemental feed costs. She had the data. 14 operations, 3 years before and after soil tests, forage production measurements, cost per pound of gain comparisons. She had built the proposal for the East Pasture around the most conservative numbers from the worst-performing client operation in her New Mexico years. She brought it to the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in July, spreading the leather notebook open next to her father's reading glasses and a cup of iced tea that was sweating rings onto the wood. Walter's wife, her mother Joanne, was on the porch shelling beans and could hear every word through the screen door. Walter looked at the grazing charts and the fencing estimates and the soil data from the New Mexico operations, and he was quiet for a long time in the way of a man who has been managing the same land for 26 years and is genuinely trying to hear something new. Then he said, "Phil, 8 paddocks on 180 acres is a lot of fence." She said, "It is." and it pays for itself in feed savings in about 28 months based on what we spent on hay the last 3 dry years. He looked at the notebook again. He picked up the cost-benefit page and read it the way you read something when you are deciding whether to argue with it or accept it. He set it down. "I need to look at this a while," he said. Joanne's voice came through the screen door even and quiet. "The hay bills have been something else, Walt." She did not say anything more. She went back to shelling beans. Walter looked at the screen door for a moment and then looked at his daughter and then looked at the notebook. He did not say yes, but he asked her to leave the notebook on the table. Let me tell you about the conversation that happened 2 weeks later at the feed store on Highway 35, because it is the conversation that gave this story its shape. Philippa had gone in on a Tuesday morning for a mineral block and a bag of fly tags, and she had the misfortune, or perhaps it was not misfortune, perhaps it was inevitable, of running into Morris Eichenbaum while she was waiting at the counter. Morris Eichenbaum had run the Eichenbaum family ranch, 880 acres of coastal prairie 7 miles to the east, for 38 years. He was 67 years old and broad across the shoulders and had the deeply weathered look of a man who had spent 4 decades outside in South Texas. He was not a difficult man. He was a man who had outlasted a lot of ideas and drawn the conclusion from this that outlasting things was the same as being right about them, which is the kind of conclusion that feels like experience when it is actually just endurance mistaken for wisdom. Philippa had not intended to get into it. She had mentioned the paddock plan offhandedly, the way you mention something you're working on, and Morris had looked up from a counter where he was sorting through a parts receipt and said, 8 paddocks. He said it the way you repeat something back when you want the other person to hear how it sounds out loud. "On the East Pasture," Philippa said, "with a planned move schedule and a longer rest period between grazings." The pause lasted about 3 seconds. Then Morris Eichenbaum made a sound, was not quite a laugh and not quite a grunt, but was somewhere between them, and he looked at the 2 men standing near the supplement display, a father and son from a rice operation south of town who came in for cattle supplies a few times a year, and they smiled the automatic smile of men who take their cues from the room's authority. "Your daddy on board with this?" Morris said. "It was my proposal," Philippa said. "He's considering it." Morris picked up his parts receipt and folded it once. 8 paddocks on 1 pasture means 8 fences to fix after every hurricane, means 8 gates to check every morning, means you're moving cattle every 10 days instead of every 2 months. He paused. "That's a way to spend a lot of time and money making the same amount of beef you're making now." He said it without malice, which is what made it land the way it did. He said it the way a man states something that is simply, plainly obvious to anyone who has been ranching long enough to know what they're talking about. Now let me ask you something, because it is worth asking. Have you ever had someone dismiss something you knew to be true, not because they had evidence against it, but because they had been doing the opposite for long enough that the opposite felt like evidence? That specific experience, not argument, just dismissal dressed up as common sense, is what Philippa Alderdice was standing inside of at the feed store counter on a Tuesday morning in July. She was 28 years old, and she was holding a bag of fly tags, and she had 3 years of management data from 14 ranches in her truck, and Morris Eichenbaum was folding his parts receipt in the way of a man who has already moved on from the conversation. She had soil tests and forage measurements and a cost-benefit analysis built on the worst-case scenario from the most challenging operation she had worked on. And none of it was material to Morris Eichenbaum because she was 28 and had spent 3 years in New Mexico instead of 3 decades in Calhoun County. And in Morris Eichenbaum's experience, those were not equivalent credentials. She did not argue. She paid for the mineral block and the fly tags, and she loaded them in her truck, and she drove the 9 miles back to the ranch on the county road, and she sat in the truck outside the barn for a few minutes with the windows down and the coastal wind coming across the pasture. That evening, Walter Alderdice told his daughter to build the 8 paddocks. He said it at the kitchen table after supper. with the notebook open in front of him and the fencing estimates beside it, and he said it in the way of a man who has been thinking carefully about something for 2 weeks and has arrived at a place he intends to stay. "You manage it," he said. "I'll help with the fencing and I'll do the moves when you're not here, but the decisions are yours." He looked at her. "If the cattle lose condition or the forage goes backward, we pull it back." "Agreed?" She said agreed. Let me tell you about the fall of 2007, because it was the first chapter of the proof. They built the paddock system over 6 weeks, starting in late August when the worst of the summer heat had broken. Philippa had sourced high tensile wire and corner posts and had drawn the layout so that each paddock had access to the lane system and to one of the 2 water points she had repositioned to eliminate the overgrazing that always happened within 200 yards of a water source. She introduced the native grass seed mix into the 3 paddocks with the lowest forage density, broadcasting Little Bluestem and Watts Grama at a rate calibrated to the soil type in the northeast section. The cattle, 58 cow-calf pairs, moved through the first rotation in 12 days per paddock. By the time they came back to paddock 1, it had been resting for 84 days. The grass was knee-high. Walter drove the tractor down the lane on the first day they moved back into paddock 1 and stopped at the gate and looked at the height and density of the forage and did not say anything for a long moment. He said, "That's not how I remember that pasture looking." Philippa said, "That's what 84 days does." He looked at it a while longer. Then he got off the tractor and opened the gate. The first winter was uneventful in the way that first winters often are. The system worked. The cattle maintained condition. The hay bill for the 2007 to 2008 winter was 22% lower than the previous years, partly because the paddocks had built enough late-season forage to carry the herd further into January before supplemental feeding became necessary. Philippa noted the number in the leather notebook in black ink and did not make much of it because one winter proved nothing. At the feed store, Morris Eichenbaum had heard about the paddock system through the network of information that connects every rural operation in a small county, and he had said what men say when they do not want to engage with data they are not yet ready to examine. He said the winter had been mild. He said the Alderdice place had always had decent grass. He said 8 paddocks was a lot of maintenance for a number you could get with 3 if you just bought more hay in the bad years. He said it with the confidence of 38 years behind him, and the men at the counter nodded, because Morris Eichenbaum had been navigating South Texas ranching since before some of them were in high school, and one mild winter on a neighbor's place was not enough to rearrange what they thought they knew. The 2008 and 2009 seasons were close to average. Philippa continued to refine the move schedule, adjusting rest periods based on the forage growth rate in each paddock, which changed with the seasons and the rainfall. She collected soil samples from each paddock annually and sent them to the Texas A&M Soil Testing Lab. The 2008 results showed marginal improvement in organic matter in 4 of the 8 paddocks. The 2009 results showed clear improvement in 6 of the 8. Including a statistically notable increase in water infiltration rate in the 3 paddocks where she had introduced the native grass seed mix. She noted the numbers in the notebook. She circled the infiltration data in red. She had also been tracking something else: the ranch's hay expenditure. In 2005, the worst dry year in recent memory before the current one, the Alderdice Ranch had spent $18,400 on supplemental hay and feed cubes to carry the herd through. In 2008, they spent $11,200. In 2009, they spent $9,800. Same herd size, same land base, different forage foundation. Walter looked at the numbers in October of 2009 and said, without particular drama, "You want to put the same system on the West Pasture?" She said yes. They started planning it before Thanksgiving. Let me tell you about the summer of 2011, because that is when the proof stopped being something you could argue with. The drought that came to the Texas Gulf Coast in the summer of 2011 was a thing that people who live through it do not talk about casually. It was the worst single-year drought in Texas since 1956, covering 75% of the state's land area simultaneously, and it arrived in Calhoun County with a particular brutality. The winter had been dry. The spring had been dry. By June, the coastal prairie that was supposed to be at its most productive was brown and brittle, and the ranchers who had been carrying their herds on perennial pasture were watching their grass disappear in real time. The county agent's office was fielding calls daily. Emergency hay was being trucked in from Louisiana and Oklahoma at prices that made experienced ranchers close their eyes when they heard them. The sale barn in Port Lavaca was running 3 times its normal cattle volume because people were selling down their herds rather than watching them lose condition. 3 ranches to the north of Seadrift sold off more than half their cow-calf pairs in July. One of them, a family operation that had been running cattle in the county for 4 generations, sold the entire herd in August and leased the land out for hunting. They said they would rebuild when conditions improved. They said it without certainty. The Alderdice Ranch pulled through. Not easily and not without cost. Walter and Philippa reduced their herd by 20% in May, a deliberate decision made before the drought deepened, not a panic response to it. They moved the remaining 46 pairs through the paddock system on a shortened rotation, giving each paddock what recovery time they could. They made one hay purchase in July, $200 worth, which was the most economical intervention available given the timing. And the soil, 4 years into the planned grazing system, did something that the soil on the conventionally managed ranches around them did not do. It held what moisture the July storms left in it. It did not run off the way compacted, continuously grazed ground runs off. The water infiltration rates Philippa had been measuring annually translated, in the worst year in living memory, into actual grass. Less of it than a normal year, but enough. She harvested 14 pounds of dry matter per square yard from the best-performing paddocks in September of 2011, which was 40% below the ranch's 3-year average, but was triple what the bare, compacted pastures on 3 neighboring operations were producing by the same measure. 2 of those operations had abandoned their summer stocker programs entirely by August. One had let 300 acres go without grazing at all, because there was nothing left to graze. Morris Eichenbaum sold 70% of his cow herd in September. He had been the largest cattle operation within 7 miles of the Alderdice Ranch in 2007. By October of 2011, he was running 40 pairs on 880 acres that looked, in places, like the surface of something that had been baked rather than grazed. Walter Aldice sat in the ranch office in November of 2011 with the hay receipts from the drought year and the previous 5 years' records beside them, and he was quiet in the way of a man who has watched his neighbors take losses he did not take. Then he said, "Phil, I want you to talk to the county agent, the new one." He said it looking at the records rather than at his daughter. "Not because you need to prove anything, because there are people in this county who need to see what you've been doing here before they make another bad year worse." Philippa looked at her father. He had aged in the way that outdoor work ages a man, evenly and with intention, and he looked at that moment like someone who had arrived at a position he had been working toward for a long time. She said she would call the county agent on Monday. He looked up. He said, "I was wrong to wait as long as I did before I said yes. I want you to know that." She did not say anything immediately. Then she said yes when it mattered. He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup. They sat together in the ranch office with the November light coming through the single window and the green metal file boxes in the corner and the leather notebook open on the desk between them. Let me tell you about the morning Morris Eichenbaum drove out to the Alderdice Ranch in the spring of 2012, because it is the part of this story that is hardest to hold on to. It was a Thursday in March, and Philippa was checking the water level in the second paddock's trough when she heard a truck on the shell gravel. She recognized the truck. She walked back through the gate and latched it and waited. Morris Eichenbaum was 68 years old, and he had spent 38 years being the man in the county who had seen everything and survived it, and there was something different in the way he got out of his truck that morning. Not diminished, something more careful. He was wearing his work clothes and his hat, and he looked at Philippa without the comfortable certainty that had been in his face at the feed store counter in 2007. "I've got about 40 pairs left," he said, "and I've got 8 acres that look like I've been hard on them for a long time, which I have." He paused. "I've been hearing about your paddock numbers, the forage production, the hay costs." Another pause. "I need to understand what you did." Philippa looked at him. She let a moment sit without filling it. Then she said, "You told me 8 paddocks was a way to spend a lot of time and money making the same amount of beef." Morris looked out at the east pasture, which was already greening in the March warmth, the native grasses coming in along the northeast ridge in a density that hadn't been there in 2007. "I know what I said," he told the pasture. "What I did," Philippa said, "is give the grass time to be grass. That's the whole system. You stop asking the land to perform before it has recovered from the last time you asked, and eventually the land remembers what it's capable of." She paused. "The hard part," she said, "is that it takes longer to see than one season. And in this county, one bad season is when everyone makes their permanent decisions." Morris Eichenbaum nodded slowly. He was looking at the paddocks, at the lane system, at the way the cattle were moving in the far corner of the rotation. He said, "You got time to walk me through the layout?" She had time. They spent 2 hours walking the east pasture and then the west. Philippa showed him the soil sample records and the forage density measurements and the water infiltration data going back to 2008. She showed him the hay expenditure comparison and the herd condition records. She showed him the notebook with the circled numbers. He looked at everything with the attention of a man who is learning something he should have learned before and knows it. At his truck before he left, he said, "I've got a neighbor who's going to ask me if this is worth doing. What do I tell him?" She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "Tell him the land has memory. Tell him the question isn't whether the system works. The question is whether he can wait long enough to see it work. That's the only hard part, the waiting." Morris Eichenbaum drove back down the shell gravel road toward the highway. Philippa watched the truck until it reached the county road and turned north. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because this story does not end in 2012. By 2014, 6 ranches in Calhoun County had implemented some version of planned grazing. The county extension agent, a younger man named Ray Castellano, who had come to the position in 2010 from a research role at Texas A&M, had been to the Alderdice Ranch 3 times and had used Philippa's forage and soil data in a presentation at the Texas Grazing Conference in San Antonio in January of 2013. She had been in the audience that day. She had not known he was going to use her data. When he put the infiltration numbers on the screen and cited the Alderdice operation by name, she had looked down at the table in front of her for a moment and then looked back up. By 2015, the Alderdice Ranch was running 74 cow-calf pairs on the same 620 acres that had supported 58 in 2007. The carrying capacity had increased by 27% without any additional land, any additional water development beyond the reposition troughs, or any change in breed or market strategy. The forage base had deepened across all 16 paddocks, both pastures now fully converted, and the native grass component along the northeast ridge had established itself into a dense, rooted stand that held the soil through the tropical storms that came off the Gulf every few years looking for something to take. Walter Alderdice retired from active ranching in 2016. He still walked the pastures every morning. He still knew every paddock's rest period without looking at the chart. He still checked the water troughs on his way back and reported anything that needed attention to Philippa, who managed the ranch remotely 2 days a week from a consulting practice she had opened in Victoria. In the summer of 2019, Philippa's son, James, who was 16 and had been walking pastures with his mother since he was old enough to be trusted around a gate latch, came to the ranch office with a printed article from a regenerative agriculture journal and a notebook of his own. a composition book with a green cover that he had been keeping since he was 13. He wanted to talk about integrating a small heritage breed pig operation into the rotation, using the pigs to prepare the paddocks for reseeding between cattle grazing events. Philippa looked at the notebook. She looked at the article. She looked at her son. She did not ask whether he had enough experience or what the neighbors would think or whether it was practical. She said, "Show me the numbers." James opened the notebook and started talking. Walter was sitting at the end of the desk with his coffee. He listened without saying anything for a long time, and then he looked at his daughter, and something moved between them that did not require words. Let me tell you one last thing, because it is the thing this story is actually about. The East pasture on the Alderdice Ranch has not been continuously grazed since the summer of 2007. The leather notebook Philippa brought back from New Mexico is full, every page, and she started a second one in 2013 and a third in 2018. She still pulls soil samples from each paddock every October and sends them to the lab in College Station. In 2023, the average organic matter reading across the 16 paddocks is 4.1%. In 2007, before the system began, it was 1.7%. That number, 4.1%, means the soil holds more water, cycles more nutrients, and supports more life per square foot than it did when she started. It is not a dramatic number. It is not a number that means anything to someone who has never stood in a dry pasture in August and watched their herd lose weight by the day. But to anyone who has, it means everything. Morris Eichenbaum rebuilt his herd. It took him until 2015. He runs 6 paddocks now on the east section of his ranch, not 8, but 6, and his hay bills are a fraction of what they were in 2011. He came to an open pasture day at the Alderdice Ranch in 2017, one of the informal gatherings Philippa started hosting after Ray Castellano asked if she would. He stood at the back of the group and listened to her talk about rest periods in soil biology and the relationship between grass roots and water. He did not say anything during the question period. Afterward, helping stack chairs before he left, he said to no one in particular, "She was right from the start." Nobody made him say more than that. It was enough. Philippa Alderdice still ranches the same 620 acres. She still carries a notebook. The East pasture, the one that started everything, is in its 17th year of planned rotation, and the native grass stand along the northeast ridge has grown into something that was not there before. She put it there, dense and rooted and present, holding the soil through every dry summer and every tropical storm and every year that comes up from the Gulf Coast looking for something to take. She gave the land time to be what it was capable of being. They told her it was too much fence, too much work, too much waiting. The drought came. The neighbors sold their herds. The pastures held. The notebook was right all along. I keep thinking about what Morris Eichenbaum said when he drove out to the Alderdice Ranch that March morning in 2012. Not the apology he didn't quite give. The thing he said instead, that he'd been hard on his land for a long time. And he knew it. He'd known it before the drought, probably, but knowing something and being willing to act on it before crisis forces your hand. Those are two very different things, and most of us spend our whole lives confusing them. What Philippa did wasn't miraculous. That's what I want to be clear about. She didn't discover something nobody had ever thought of. Planned grazing had been studied and documented for decades before she came home from New Mexico. The science was there. The data was there. What she brought was the integrity to apply it even when the people around her had already decided she was wrong, and the patience to wait for the years to prove what one season never could. That's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. The integrity piece. It would have been easier, significantly easier, to let Morris Eichenbaum's dismissal settle into her and reshape the proposal into something more palatable. To say 8 paddocks was maybe too many, maybe 6, maybe let's just try 3 and see how it goes. A lot of good ideas die that way, not by being defeated, but by being slowly diluted until they stop working, and then they get blamed for not working. Philippa didn't do that. She went home from the feed store, sat in her truck for a few minutes, and then went inside and built the system she knew was right. That took something real, something that had been built over years of doing hard work in hard country and watching what happened when you paid attention. The intelligence she brought to this wasn't just academic. Yes, she had the coursework and the research and the leather notebook full of data from 14 operations in New Mexico. But what made the data useful was the way she thought about it. Not as proof she was right and Morris was wrong, but as a map of how to give the land what it actually needed instead of what was convenient. She adjusted the rotation as the seasons changed. She watched what each paddock was doing and modified the schedule accordingly. She was learning the whole time, which is the only way any system survives contact with real conditions. Smart isn't knowing the answer before you start. Smart is being willing to keep asking the question after you think you have it. And then there's the part that most people underestimate, the sheer endurance of it. 4 years of building soil organic matter before a drought came to test it. 4 years of neighbors driving by and not stopping, or stopping to say it wouldn't scale, or saying one good winter didn't prove anything. 4 years of recording numbers in a notebook that nobody was asking to see yet. That kind of persistence isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like courage from the outside. It looks like stubbornness, and sometimes the people doing it aren't even sure which one it is. But Philippa kept measuring, kept moving the cattle, kept writing the numbers down, and when 2011 came with everything it brought, the land remembered what she had given it. That's what I take from this. The cause and the effect are always connected, even when years separate them. The water that stayed in the soil during the drought stayed there because of decisions made when there was no drought, when there was no pressure, when it would have been just as easy to manage the old way. The outcome in 2011 was earned in 2007, 2008, 2009, 2009. In every quiet season when Philippa showed up and did the work anyway. That's how it actually goes, not in the dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of the ordinary ones. Walter Alderdice was the first person to stand by his daughter's work. He may not have understood all of it in the beginning, but he said yes when it counted, and then he got out of the way and let her work. That matters too.